Good morning, everyone. Good morning. I'm Nikki Saylor. I'm director of the American Folklife Center here at the Library of Congress. Welcome to today's symposium, Black Banjo Renaissance, Reflections on the Future. We're eager to learn from some of the leading musicians, scholars, and banjo makers in the United States involved in the Black Banjo Renaissance, a movement to reclaim and sustain the legacies of African American banjo players. We're delighted that these experts are here with us today to talk about not only the histories of the music and cultures, but also point us toward future directions of this important community. Before I go any further, I'd like to tell you a little bit about the Library of Congress and the American Folklife Center. The Library of Congress is the largest library in the world. Our mission is to engage, inspire, and inform Congress and the American people with the universal and enduring source of knowledge and creativity. The American Folklife Center is a division in the Library of Congress. We are the nation's Center for Folklife Documentation and Research. We were established by Congress in 1976, so 50 years ago, to preserve and present folklife. We carry out this directive by stewarding archival collections, creating public programs such as this one, and exchanging knowledge and expertise. The Center Archives is one of the largest ethnographic archives in the world. We steward several collections of Black banjo music featuring performers like Joe Thompson, Elizabeth Cotton, Dink Roberts, and Jake Blunt. This year, the Folklife Center is celebrating 50 years with a range of public programs and a large-scale exhibit called Alive in Many Hands, which opens in mid-September in the library's Thomas Jefferson building. We welcome all of you to return to the library to experience this exhibition, and it will be here through early 2028. Okay, so on to it for today's symposium. We have the great pleasure of collaborating with ethnomusicologist Joe Z. Johnson. Yeah, give it up. Joe, that's right. Joe is a PhD candidate at Indiana University in the Department of Folklore and Ethnomusicology. His dissertation research focuses on the Black Banjo Renaissance, and he has been instrumental in curating today's events. Joe is no stranger to the American Folklife Center. Last year, he gave a lecture on his research as part of the AFC's Benjamin Botkin Lecture Series, and Joe is a former summer intern at the American Folklife Center. It has been a pleasure for us to work with Joe for this event. So now let me welcome you, Joe, to the stage, and he can tell you more about the program. Thank you.
Thanks, Nicole, for that kind introduction. As she stated, my name is Joe Johnson. I'm a PhD candidate at Indiana University, Bloomington in the Department of Folklore and Ethnomusicology. And I've had the pleasure of working with my colleagues here at the library to curate today's event. Before we begin, just a quick show of hands. How many of you know that the banjo is an African instrument? Interesting. My time at the library, like Nicole said, began here as an intern at the American Folklife Center, where I curated a research guide on African American banjo players. That work led me to deeper questions about history, memory, and cultural traditions that get preserved or obscured. It also led me to think about W.E.B. Du Bois, who wrote about the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. And that line still shapes how we talk about race, class, and culture, and even the banjo. Du Bois also gave us the concept of the veil, or that barrier between Black life that is often Black life as it's lived and as it's perceived. Beyond the veil, Black communities, we create, adapt, and survive. Outside of the veil, that richness is often distorted or even erased, even discussed primarily through this white lens. So today we're looking black through that veil and across the color line to understand the long life of the banjo in Black hands. The banjo is not simply an instrument, but it's a site where race, class, colorism, and history collide. I asked at the beginning how many of us knew the banjo was African, and there is a truth to that statement, but as Justin Robinson often reminds me, people often jump straight from 2006 back to pre-colonial Africa, skipping 400 years of Black creativity in the Americas when they're talking about the banjo. Previous research by people like Kristina Gaddy, Pete Ross, Laurent Dubois, Dina Epstein, Cece Conway, Scott Odell, and so many others show that the banjo ultimately emerged in the Caribbean as a fusion of African diasporic instruments and practices. The akonting and ngoni, instruments that are often cited as antecedents, are important ancestors or predecessors, but the banjo itself was a diasporic innovation, Black cultural genius in action. Focusing only on an African origin takes away the agency of enslaved people and living African Americans who have innovated in the face of centuries of brutality. And it also reinforces the white supremacist myth that nothing creative happened during enslavement. That's the veil at work. That's the veil at work, and that's also the color line. My research and the work of today's panelists point towards a Black-centered approach that makes room for some of these difficult conversations. African precedents, the exploitation of the banjo through blackface minstrelsy, and the harder work of examining class, color, and privilege within our own communities. That work is the work of this symposium, of unlearning, of reconnecting, reclaiming, and also imagining what could be. During today's symposium, I want you all to consider one question. Once we understand the banjo's Black roots, what will we actually do with that knowledge today? For those of you who aren't Black, it's not your role to lift the veil on Black communities' behalfs, but you can ask yourself how the veil and the color line operate within your own communities and your own practices, and how you confront it in your everyday life. Not to satisfy your own guilt or shame, but actively to do the work of repairing harm that was caused. The banjo ultimately then represents lives, stories, and endurance of Black communities, and we all have a role in telling that story truthfully. The contemporary Black Banjo Renaissance rests on the work of many people, but there are a couple who are especially central. Cece Conway and Scott Odell's research first brought public attention to the banjo's African diasporic and African American roots. Beyond building on that, Tony Thomas did work to recognize need for spaces that address the banjo's history and the difficulty discussing it, and he helped build an online community in the early 2000s. And then in 2005, Sule Greg Wilson, working alongside Thomas and Conway and others, helped organize the Black Banjo Gathering at App State University in Boone, North Carolina. And that gathering also brought together other musicians who would later on form the Grammy Award-winning string band, the Carolina Chocolate Drops, including Justin Robinson, Dom Flemons, and Rhiannon Giddens. These innovators ultimately introduced new audiences to Black string band music and helped us inspire a new generation devoted to the banjo's Black roots. And therefore, I point to that gathering as the start of this movement of the Black Banjo Renaissance, this ongoing practice of Black banjo players, instrument makers, community organizers, and scholars reclaiming the instrument's history while simultaneously imagining its future. So today's symposium reflects the growth of this movement. It ultimately ends by exploring the politics of sonic citizenship, which explores what it means to live in the wake of the banjo's complicated history and the work of organizing community around that knowledge. Before that, we will hear from artists, scholars, and cultural workers, placing the banjo in conversation with contemporary Black life. And before that, we will examine questions of record keeping, archival memory, and our responsibility when we meet the ancestors in the archive. But we begin today where the banjos themselves begin, with the instrument builders and makers whose work sits at the intersection of history and practice. And through their materials, methods, and creative choices, they show us how the past can be held, heard, and remade in the present. So it's my pleasure to welcome our first panel to the stage, Instrument Builders at the Intersection of History and Praxis. Thank you.
Good morning. Am I on? Am I on? All right. So good morning. This session is Building the Gourd Banjo, Instrument Building at the Intersection of History and Praxis. My name is Lilian Werbin. Thank you for following my face to this room. I am co-owner and CEO of Elderly Instruments, a fretted musical retailer and repair shop in Lansing, Michigan. I also co-organize the Banjo Gathering, as it currently is, with Kristina. Through these two entities, I've had many opportunities to view the evolution of banjo making and building, as well as the cultural impact of this instrument. I am quite thrilled to be moderating this panel about how instrument building is affected by history and praxis. And so before I let our panelists tell you more about their work and how they approach this, I'd like to do a bit of setting the stage. To prep for this, I really spent a lot of time with the title of this session. And so building the gourd banjo at the most literal level is about the physical process of building this instrument. Instrument building at the intersection of history raises questions about where the banjo came from, how its story has been documented, and whose knowledge has been preserved and overlooked. The word history also invites a question about evidence. Makers who want to understand early banjos often have to work from incomplete records. Historical research may offer clues, but not always a complete roadmap. For those who are new to this world of early banjo, 20, certainly 30 years ago, very few people knew what a gourd banjo was, let alone how to build one. And very few of the early banjos that we're going to discuss survived the ages. And what did survive is a very small sampling or pieces, which brings us to praxis, or putting the knowledge to work. So that's hands-on learning through doing. And the concept is especially important here because building itself is a form of research when it comes to these instruments. So this conversation sits between what the historical record tells us and what the hands, materials, and sounds of today can teach us. And so with that, I'd like to give the names of our panelists and then we'll go back through. So we have Pete Ross, Kristina Gaddy, Dr. Dena Jennings, and Samaria Marley. And we'll start with our first slideshow or presentation.
Which one?
Yeah, Pete?
Am I up first?
I think
Yes.
you are, in fact.
Okay.
Pete Ross.
Hi, it's good to be at the Library of Congress. When I got into this, I started with that slide because that's sort of the only things we had to work with 35 years ago, and I did spend a lot of time here at Library of Congress in the Performing Arts Library, digging through old books of music, early banjo primers as part of what informed me. And I'm going to try to just go through these pictures really quickly to let you give you an idea of what my work's been like. The starting point it was a revelation to me to learn that the banjo was black at all. Nobody else seemed to care about that. And in addition to wanting to as I went through the material I saw here at the library, I realized how central the banjo was to the formation of American culture. And the fact that this central role and the instrument's origins had been erased was like an injustice I wanted to undo. I wanted to recreate the instruments I couldn't hear anymore, but I also saw the banjo as just an amazing tool for people to understand our history generally as well as our specific cultural history. So next slide, please. So these are examples of the recreations I make that are strictly historic. The banjos on either side. One's in Paris, the other's in Lyon, France. I've gone to examine them. These are two of the four definite early banjos. The one in the middle, I think, is a recreation of the old plantation banjo. The painting in the John Rose watercolor shows you how high the action is on those. And this idea of praxis, I'll just say briefly, like, for instance, the instrument on the left, we examined it when it turned up 4 or 5 years ago. Kristina and I went to examine it, and I couldn't figure out what the finish was. It was completely covered in finish. So give you an idea of the kind of things I do, we traveled on the eastern shore of Maryland, a place that does historic boat building, because I thought it looked like a pine tar finish that's used on 18th century ships. They still do it there. I went there to look at the materials, and this is the sort of thing that informs my work, as well as the objects themselves. It's that sort of dissection. Okay, next slide. That's just me in my workshop. That's the sort of thing I do to make some of the historic recreations. I recreate the patinas with various paints. I create the patterns based on photographs of the early instruments. Next slide, please. These are historic instruments. These are instruments I made in the historic form, but they're adjusted for modern players. So I raised the fingerboard to the height of the bridge, so the strings are closer to the fingerboard than they would have been in the 18th and early 19th century. But you can see they look the same, but this, seen at a three-quarter view like this, you can see that they've been altered. I don't know if we may get a chance to discuss why that neck is so far and the action is so high on actual early banjos. There's a reason for it that Kristina figured out. It's in her book. Next slide, please. And these are sort of what the contemporary gourd banjo has been since, I guess, the late 1980s when I first got into this, which is essentially a 1840s wooden rim banjo neck with a gourd attached to it. We don't think anything like this was made as part of the long-standing tradition. It's something that mostly really happened starting in the 1990s. There's one historic example. It's now on display at the Met, and we can talk about that maybe if we have a chance. But this is the sort of thing I get asked to do most frequently. It's that 1840s neck with personal variations I work through. One has the peg head of an 1830s guitar. Another has inlaid patterns from Suriname, all sorts of things, various historic variations. Okay, next slide, please. Just some close details. There's that Surinamese inlay. It was a long piece of ebony inlaid into mahogany. But still, it's referencing the old stuff, but it's still in the form of the 1840s instruments, 1850s instruments. Next slide, please. And I also, at this point, make wooden rim banjos, and that's an array of, on the left, the sort of fancy Victorian age instruments that it's closer to the banjo most people see today, with lots of pearl inlay. And then some in the middle that are more, again, 1840s, early minstrel era banjos. I put a little more neck angle on them to make them a little more playable. I think the one second from the right belongs to Peter Zago that's here. It was also sort of it was a fun commission. It was a little bit of a hybrid of the 1840s, 1850s banjos for a man who just collected many of them, established one of the world's leading collections of it. But, you know, the kind of things that makes commissions fun. Next slide, please. These are some close-ups. You know, in addition to exploring history, I've learned some traditional lutherie techniques, like things that bring out the curl and maple inlay. This guy on the left wanted all sorts of, I don't know, like 19th century metaphysical imagery on his banjo. It was kind of fun. Getting pretty far from the history of the instrument, but I don't know, it keeps things interesting for me. And you know, things, there's Peter's banjo again on the right. It's, again, it was a challenge to get that rim that color, but leave the rim cap unstained. Like, it's a real challenge. Most people know about it, but keeps the job interesting. And next slide, please. Well, those are the inlays. There's some of our metaphysics, you know, fox running, and then some on the left, some of the traditional, sort of, not traditional, but 1890s high Victorian banjo images. And, you know, I did an apprenticeship early on with a dying luthier in Mississippi, Scott Didlake, and then I more recently had the Maryland State Arts Council pay for me to do an apprenticeship with Kevin Enoch, learning to do this style of sort of 19th century inlay. Next slide. Yeah, and then finally, there on the happy moment for me, this array of things I do. The banjo was just placed in the Metropolitan Museum of Art on the left, gourd banjo. Again, a fancy Victorian inlay on the pig. I just recreated that, add some of my own stuff to it. Second from the right, I made for Joe, who you just heard speak. It's got the pattern on the fingerboard of a traditional African-American quilting pattern. And on the right, again, the the Lyon, a recreation of the banjo that's in Lyon. And, you know, I don't know what people think when they see this array. Like, your average person might most appreciate the sort of very technical work on the Victorian stuff, but to me, like, the challenges of recreating the instrument that looks a little more rough around the edges on the right, and giving a voice back to these instruments that were entirely missing from the record when I got into this is really at least as satisfying as the really technical work. I think that's my last slide. Yep, thanks.
And I think we'll do Kristina Gaddy's intro. Would you like my intro?
Hi. I don't build banjos.
However, you research them. We will talk about Kristina's work in a bit. So we'll do Dr. Dena Jennings.
Hello, I'm Dr. Dena Jennings. You can call me Dena, you can call me Dr. Dena. For those of you who are my age, you can remember, but you doesn't have to call me Johnson. Remember that? So I am a banjo builder, gourd instrument builder. I build just about anything you can dream up. I'm not building replicas. I'm not building anything that may have existed before except in your own mind. So I've had people come out to my farm, which is 116 acres out in central Virginia, and that's where we have our event, which you'll hear about more later, the Appalachian On Time Music Gathering. And we spend a week together, eat, sleep, and drink banjo. We feed you, we house you, and you figure out what you want to create. And I think a lot of that came from my stepdad. My family origin is Kentucky, even though I grew up in Ohio. So the hollers of Kentucky I call home. I spent a lot of summers there. But my stepdad liked to build things out of wood, and he would build anything. Driftwood, he'd find wood from work, he'd just bring wood home and make things. And some of you have been at my barn, you see that old harp that's upstairs, that's a harp that he actually built. So I'm coming at this from, that's why I appreciate the 400 years, because I have 8 generations of named people that I have to reach way past in order to find an ancestor in some place in Africa that I've never heard of. So we've got to keep that in mind when we're thinking about the banjo, its impact on American culture, on US culture, and those of us here who look like me, who can name their families, spent time on those family lands and grew things. So I just have a work sample of what I do, and this will show you a little bit of the event, the Appalachian On Time Music Gathering, which you're all invited to. Third weekend in September, come down and see us. Thank you. This is me singing. First you kiss me, then you tease me, then you tell me you'll never leave me. Promise that as you walked out the door, you're my yo-yo beau. You're my yo-yo beau. First you love me, then you snub me, then you tell me you're dreaming of me. Promise we'd never fall in love. You're my yo-yo beau. You're my yo-yo beau. I can't live with you. I can't live without you. Around the world and walk in the dark too. All things the same without your silly changes. That's not for me. We would feel like strangers. First you like me, then you don't. Said you would, now you won't. Promise the moon and the stars up above. You're my yo-yo beau. You're my yo-yo beau.
You're rocking the crib with all this complaining. knotted my string, left me in a spin. I can't live with you, I can't live without you. Grab your traveling shoes, we've got things to do.
Around the world and walking the dog, then back to sleep.
Loving you is like rolling a log.
Snapping my wrist and catching the ball, then back to sleep.
So many tricks, but I know them all, dear.
First you kiss me,
Come
then
on,
you
baby
tease
girl,
me,
let's go.
then you tell me you'll never leave me. Promise that as you walk
time
up
to
the
walk.
door,
We're working
you're my
it out.
yo-yo bow.
I feel it good.
You're my yo-yo bow.
Let's get busy.
You're my yo-yo bow.
Real busy.
Mend your heart while I hold your hand. Take all the time your spirit needs. I'm forever your loving friend. Don't let go. Just hold my hand. Through the storm, through the rain, more than loving you in sickness and pain, I will stand with you, your loving friend. I'll hold your hand until the end, and again I'll stand with you forever. I'll stay forever. I'm with you always.
And next, we will have Samaria Marley.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Samaria, and I live in Brandywine, Maryland, which is about an hour south of here. And I am a new banjo builder, so it's an honor to be up here on this panel today. And so I'm going to share a little bit about how I got into banjo building. And so I am a farmer and an herbalist, and also a singer and a musician. And so I have been farming in DC since about 2014, managing urban farms in DC, and also performing in the area, in the DMV area. And it was about 2022 that I had to organize a workshop with Michael Carter Jr. in Virginia. And it was around Africulture, and Dena Jennings was doing a display there. And at first I didn't understand. I was like, why is there a gourd banjo workshop at this agricultural workshop that we're doing? I don't understand. But once I got there and I met her and I heard her presentation, my mind was blown. I was just like, oh my goodness, this is amazing. And I don't know if I, kind of knew the Black origins of the banjo. I had a banjo, but I never played it. But just what she shared, and then there was an opportunity to make like a banjo kit, or a banjo from a little kit. And I was like, I have to be at that table. I gotta be there. And so I think I was like asking her a bunch of questions and just was like, tell me more, please. And it was really like an epiphany moment for me as a musician and a farmer of like, oh, finally there's something that brings these two things that I love so much together. And I think for a while I didn't know how to be both of those things. And that was a moment where I was like, okay, I understand how these things come together. And so I just kind of became obsessed with the banjo, which I think probably many of us in this room have become. And Dena was doing a display at the Richmond Folk Festival, and I was in Virginia for something else, and I was like, I'm gonna go there, and I'm gonna see if she will sell me a banjo. And I went, and I was like, hey, do you remember me? Like, can I buy a banjo from you? And she was like, you could make one. And I was like, what? Me, make one, you know? But that like planted a seed for me. So, next slide. And so that is, the top pictures are from that workshop. That's the little banjo that we got to make with Dena. And so I am a mom. I have, at the time, 3 kids, but I have a busy life. And Dena was saying, oh, you can come down and you can stay for a week. And I was like, I don't know where I will find the time to do that, you know, with kids. And so I like got a banjo kit offline and I built that. And I also, you know, manage a farm that's kind of like a cultural hub in Maryland, and we organized a festival that was all about creating art from nature. And I was like, this is my chance to build a banjo. Like, I'm gonna do it. I got some equipment, and I watched this video that Jeff Menzies made about building a banjo. And so that week, I just like tried as hard as I could to just figure out how to build a banjo. And luckily my partner is a builder, and so he helped me out. And so then the picture kind of like in the forest was my like piece that I put together, which was an ode to the banjo. Of, you know, there's roots of the banjo in Maryland, in Southern Maryland, right by where I live, and so I felt like it was really important to honor that. I live on an old plantation in Southern Maryland, so I really wanted to like highlight that for my community. And then a few, maybe weeks later, Dena reached out to me to see if I could apprentice with her. And so I got to work with her to finish that banjo that I started. And I made a lot of mistakes, but she really helped me and is just a wonderful teacher and wonderful person. And so I'm really grateful that I got that opportunity to work with her in that way. Next slide. And then I went to Jamaica last year and did a week-long workshop with Jeff Menzies. And I had a better understanding of how it all worked. And so I was able to build another banjo and kind of put some like artistic elements into it that I didn't do the first time. I made it a little bit shorter than the first one. And so it felt really good to have that opportunity to try again. And really kind of begin to hone my skills. Next slide. And so what I've been doing is learning how to grow gourds on my farm, which has been interesting, and also doing, like, sharing about the history of the banjo in Maryland. A lot of the work that I do is around reconnecting Black people to agriculture, to herbalism, to our history, and uplifting that history. And so I, utilize the banjo and the gourd banjos to share about the history, sometimes the unknown history of the banjo with people in my community. Next slide. And another way that I do that is through cultural organizing and organizing events. So all of these pictures are by Frankie, who is right here. And we just hosted this one-day festival on my farm that brought all these folks together to really share the diversity of Black people playing the banjo, because we don't all play it the same. We play it differently. And so that is the work that I really want to be doing in my community, is bringing people together, sharing about the history, and the gourd banjo has really been a wonderful way to get into doing that work. Thank you.
I'm lucky because I get to see all of these people's work often, but I'm excited to learn about your work, and I'm going to fix how I mispronounce your name. So
Everybody.
I apologize. I kind of want to speak about how Dena and Kristina got minorly obsessed with the banjo, because both of you spoke about what encouraged you to be more involved and what interested you in building. But I'd like to hear about what took you down the rabbit hole of uncovering Black banjo roots, and what is the kind of responsibility or the weight that you carry because it is in fact a Black instrument. Mm-hmm.
I think the answer is for me, it's like very simple but very complex, and that is, I found out something that I thought I was going to share with a very small group of obsessed people, and very quickly that became bigger. And Peter Zago, who's here, was like, "Well, you're finding such interesting stuff here. You can't just keep it to yourself." And I am a writer, and he said, "Is this going to be a book? Isn't this going to be something that you share?" And that is what it ended up being in Well of Souls, Uncovering the Banjo's Hidden History, because it was, to Pete's point, it wasn't just this little thing about a gourd banjo, right? It was about, as Joe said, that veil, right, of what this life that exists beyond the normal stories that are told, right? If we just say the banjo's from Africa, we're missing 400 years, and not only just 400 years, but we're missing the names of the people who made the instruments. We're missing what music did they play on it, what, how did they dance, what was this a part of, what was this cultural life, and bringing that to the fore was really important to me, mostly because I found it personally very interesting, again, in this reflection of American history of the Americas, of colonialism, the impacts of colonialism. And it's also, just a very, I think, important for me that, not gonna, it's being recorded. White people messed this up. White people messed up this history. They distorted it. They were the ones who erased it. And it's not, kind of fair in my mind to just say, okay, then, now Black folks can go and repair it, right? That if I have the knowledge, skills, and ability to write about this and uncover this, that I should be doing that. If I care about it, and making other people care about it as well.
Thank you. Dena, you spoke about Kentucky roots, but I've also heard you speak about just kind of the joy that the music brought you as a kid and wanting to recreate that. What is the experience of planting those seeds in other people?
I come from a long history of Kentuckians. We come from the hollers of Kentucky. We unscrewed like a light bulb from Kentucky and screwed back in Ohio. And a lot of people say, oh, that was a great migration. Actually, the Great Migration was the largest refugee crisis in North America. And the older I get, the more I understand that the little segment of our family that came north came because of a murder. That didn't stop my mom from sending me down there in the summers because I was a little bit of a wild child, wild in the sense of nature. I was always outside, I was always digging in holes and picking up stuff, and she says, you need to be on a farm, go down there with Aunt Christine and her 19 kids and hang out. And so the only thing we did in that time was go to church and play music on the porch and eat lots of good food. So that was my start in learning this music and hearing this music. I'm a physician. I went on to make instruments of Appalachia, one of which is a lumberjack. And because of my experience as a physician, I've probably done more knee replacements than I have made lumberjacks. And because of that, my lumberjacks are pretty limber. So when I took that lumberjack home and showed it to my dad and said, look at this thing, he goes, boy, that sure looks like Brother Old Joe Williams shouting. And I said, okay, so flat-footing is shouting. Okay. And I hadn't made that connection before. So now, fast forward to even yesterday, when we had a dialogue about what is flat-footing, what is buck dancing, what is clogging. I mentioned that story, and one of our dear friends who's here today said, but I know how to do that. Why am I taking a workshop from somebody to learn how to do that? She already knew how to do that. She just didn't know it in that frame. So that's planting a huge happy seed that I get to plant, somebody else gets to water, and then divine love gets to give the increase. So.
Thank you. And Samaria, how do you ensure that the resurgence of gourd banjo making strengthens the Black participation, ownership, and authority within the tradition?
I haven't gotten the opportunity to do it yet, but I really want to be able to host a banjo build on my farm. My partner, he's a builder, like that's his job. And so we have a wood shop, a barn, and lots of tools, and he hosts like timber framing and carpentry workshops. So I think me and him together, with me having the experience of building a few and him with the technical skill, that's something that we really can do. And our farm is a space for Black people, a lot who live in DC, in this area, to get out of the city and come be in nature in a safe space. We're doing a juke joint August 22nd. We did one last year. You know, we really want to create a space for our people to be there, to connect with their culture and their history and their heritage on land. And so that is the ways that I see of being able to do this work. You know, I think a lot about how this music was played by people who worked the land. You know, it's like you would work all day and then your joy was probably playing the banjo or playing the fiddle. And so I really want to be like bringing those things back together in the work that I do.
I'm loving these answers. Sorry, while I get caught up. So how does the identity or lived experience of the maker shape the instrument? We've heard about different design aspects and materials used, but I'd like to hear from all of you about what part of you are you leaving with what you've made?
I got that. And this gives me an opportunity to do something I don't usually get to do publicly, but to just recognize Pete Ross and what his impact has been on me for years before I actually met Pete. I was just digging through everything he made. Oh, that's a Pete Ross. Oh, that's Pete Ross. Oh, that. And when I first laid my hands on one, I was like, oh my God, this is a Pete Ross. And I did the same thing with Jeff Menzies. Oh, that's a Jeff. Oh, that's a Jeff. Oh, that's a Jeff. When I finally held one, it's like, oh, for crying out loud, that's Jeff Menzies, right? They put so much of themselves into their instrument, and I wanted to be able to do that too. So when Samaria showed me the banjo that she was working on, before she got it out of the bag, I said, that's a Jeff Menzies. And I didn't realize that she had been studying Jeff Menzies. So we each put ourselves into that banjo. It's sort of like a thumbprint, a fingerprint, a signature that if you're paying attention, you see people's signatures all over. And I'm hoping that I do that with mine. I can't name what I put in mine. Somebody else has to recognize it, you know? Like, it's sort of like hearing your voice on a recording. You hear your voice on a recording, you go, ew, is that what I sound like, really? But everybody knows your voice. You could be in a room and everybody else in the other room and they hear you and like, oh, Dena's over there. But if I heard a recording of me, I'd be like, that's not me. So I think it's something that somebody has to tell you.
Can I give a brief shout out to Joe for this reason, that Joe's PhD does interview banjo builders, and I know some of what he's written about his experience observing Dena, interviewing her, and so he can definitely tell you what he sees in your building, what you've left behind in your banjos.
I'll say as a very new banjo builder, that's something I'm still discovering, but I did learn that the Jeff Menzies banjo is way too long for me. It's way too, he's much bigger. And so when I made my second one after playing that first one, I was like, okay, I really want to shorten this. And so I had the ability to make that and play it and then say, okay, I'm going to design one that fits my body more. And it's a little short, the pot is really big, and so I know for my next one, okay, I'm gonna find a smaller gourd, so I'm really still figuring that out for myself.
So I guess my entire project working on banjos really starts from, the peaceful part is a fascination with history, but there's also sort of a fury at ignorance and distortion of history. So that's not in the physical object, but that's sort of what set me down trying to correct that, and just sort of an anger at whatever the powers that be, commercialized music, sort of imposing their identities on the rest of us. It's, long time issue for me from my time as a little punk rock kid in Reagan era DC, that's rage at bullies and things. But then the physical objects, I wanted to undo these things and be a corrective to those. But then, you're also just an artist when you're creating these things. So there's my fascination with the arts of the 19th century, looking at all sorts of musical instruments, looking at furniture and architecture, looking at sort of public art, typefaces of the 19th century, early 19th century sort of influenced some of my aesthetics. These things, when you're an artist, these things all impress themselves on you. You got to be hungry for these things all the time, and then you express them through your art back out. So it's all these things, and giving, just again back to my first note, giving voice to people who are central to the origin of our culture, whose voices had been erased.
Everyone has spoken about the emotional impact of not only building but interacting with this history. In terms of the fury or the joy or the dissonance in general, how do you leave that at the bench so that you can pick it up again later?
If it even gets to the bench, I have a wonderful connection to Lilian that she might or might not even know about, is this banjo ukulele that I have right here. I don't know if Pete runs into this, but a lot of times people hear that you build gorge banjos. But you're not a real luthier, are you? Yeah. All that physics and sound waves and string lengths and all that stuff, I can nerd out about that. But what I did was I picked this up as an as-is from Elderly. And I took it to someone before I started really building, and they said, that'll never play, hang it on your wall. And I said, okay. So I hung it on my wall. This is a Lion and Healy 1920 banjo ukulele. Sometimes I would turn it around and hang it backwards because of that beautiful enamel. And these were a dime a dozen. There's a whole bunch of these, but not too many had a complete enamel back. So I was glad to get it. And the more I learned, the more I kept working. When I learned how to do fret work, because I don't just make fretless, I learned how to do fret work and I had the tools to do it. I picked this up, and what was unplayable before suddenly had a voice. All it needed was a fret job. Because over the years, the frets had bowed. I didn't even need to put new frets on it. They just needed a cleanup and a new bridge. And now it's my go-to instrument. the one that had no voice that was never going to play. It has its voice back. So for me, the first time that I'm working with a piece of wood and I turn around too fast and I put it on the bench and it goes hum, I'm like, oh, that's its voice. So that's the piece that I bring to it, is the wonder and the amazement. And yeah, there's all the other that goes with it too. But at the same time, nothing for me outrides that wonder and amazement when that wood hits the bench and it's not even a gourd yet. I mean, it's not even a banjo yet. It's just a blank neck. And because it's chestnut or because it's black walnut or whatever it is, it's got its own voice.
This is good. I kind of want to keep on this train of thought. But let's talk more about the research that you've done in terms of giving as-is instruments or unplayable instruments their voice back. Because there is creation and then there's preservation and there's, restoration.
Revelation.
Ooh, it's a Savage Garden song. So how do you approach those different facets? Yeah, I mean, like I know the work is different because I watch other people do the work, but I would like to hear about how you actually think about it and maybe the different starting steps it takes. Let's start with Pete.
Wait, so how we start, the steps it takes, is that what you're saying?
So when you're building a gourd recreation versus a contemporary banjo with historical pieces.
I mean, well, it might be interesting to talk about how that's changed over time, because, when I started, there was one surviving example from Suriname that was in a collection in the Netherlands, and it didn't really resemble the images of very early banjos we had that came out of the States, or even Jamaica, Haiti, places like that. So I chose not to attempt a reconstruction of that one. So that left me with my original challenge was working with scraps of historical descriptions and images, and this gets back to your introduction, Lily, which is there were really bits and pieces, and sometimes I had to use a written description. These were never complete. These were not done by people who were trying to make a study of this instrument. These were sort of anecdotal material in diaries or letters, maybe books I'm sure many people here have read some of these descriptions, or you could guess if you haven't that they're pretty dismissive of the instrument early on. So they didn't bother being complete or entirely accurate. So I would take a written description that was a fragment, compare it to an unclear image, piece of folk art, and say, okay, these seem to be describing a similar thing, and what conclusion can I draw from that? And from that, I would build the whole thing. I could reconstruct the whole thing bit by bit, and that would evolve over time as I reinterpreted these pieces of evidence, or more evidence turned up. And it was pleasing to me when some of these instruments began turning up in 2003, 2005, and I had gotten really close. I was really happy with that, but there were some decided differences. But then it allowed me to move forward, and even those had some missing parts that I had to replace and I had to deduce, and had to make some informed guesses. And I don't know if this may be a chance to talk about Kristina's process, which is one of the real revelations when we got our 4 early banjos is the notion of the string action being really, really high, and they made them, if you're used to contemporary fiddle or guitar or banjo, you wouldn't be able to figure it out. And at this point, I'd studied some of the African instruments that are still made there, and knew that wasn't some sort of ancestral state. This was a choice that was made in the New World, and I really couldn't. Why would you make the instrument seemingly harder to play? And then when Kristina was working on Well of Souls and beginning to understand the spiritual framework that the banjo was built within and created for, then suddenly that choice made more sense. The spiritual demands of the instrument outweighed the need to have an instrument you could be as virtuosic with as you could with a ngoni or a kanting.
I too want to hear about Kristina's research. And when you say following the bits to kind of see how history is, you can follow history to understand what was built. I'd like to hear from Kristina about the process of following those same bits, but then documenting them in a full story for us to understand and hold on to.
So I think that the idea of this panel of history and praxis together is really important, because you can look at that image or you can read that description, and you can even look at the physical banjo that survives in the archive. But those are not objects that bring us to where we want to be, which is to have people playing this instrument again, right? Those instruments that are the 4 gourd banjos that are all in European collections, none of them are in playable condition, and nor should they be put in playable condition. These are the only artifacts, the only evidence that we have that is created by the people themselves who played this instrument or made this instrument, right? All of these other descriptions, those watercolors, those paintings, those are made by white people, and it is through their lens that we are seeing them. And those objects, those are the product of the hands who made them, likely enslaved men. And so if we were to do something to those objects, and break a piece off, we've lost a piece of their history, we've lost a piece of their voice that we're trying to bring back. And so that's where it is important to think about not just those historical things, but how we can resurrect that and engage with it today. And Pete being able to then take that instrument and make a playable version of it and see, okay, this action is crazy. You can't play above the 5th fret, right? So what does that mean about repertoire? What does that mean about the spiritual element? What does that mean about the people who played the instrument? And without that praxis element, we can't kind of fully understand, we'll never be able to fully understand these lives that are long gone, but we can't even kind of begin to understand what that experience of playing the instrument was like in these places. So I think it was really important for me to have those conversations with Pete about the making, and having been able to observe, examine these instruments in Europe with Pete. It's amazing, right? He looks at fingerwear. You see fingerwear on your own instrument, and then if you start to think about what your favorite tune is, or what your favorite tuning is, or how you play, you'd be like, yep, I'm wearing those spots down. Or you can think about how old an instrument is. When I wrote Well of Souls, I was absolutely convinced that even though it was collected in 1840, the Haitian Bancha, even though it was collected in 1840, through Pete's observations of it, that it could be 50 years old or older. And my editor was dismissive of that idea. And she said, how possibly could this gourd banjo have survived for that long? And my answer was, well, this was a really important object to the person who made it. It was of religious, spiritual significance, and so they would have treated it with care. They also clearly tried to keep it alive, through adding tacks and adding skin and adding lots of stuff to it. And so I said, I think it could be that old. She gave it to me. She let me write that. with the caveat of like it could be that old. The French government is actually very interested in their kind of patrimony and their heritage, and they kind of under our advisement decided to carbon date test the Haitian bancha and the Lyon banjo, and in fact found out that the Haitian bancha was probably 50 or 60 years old when it was collected, and so that it actually came from before the Haitian Revolution.
So it appears like the banjo in the 1790s genre's watercolor, we commonly call the old plantation, and it turns out it is a contemporary of that instrument. And
Yeah, they would have both been around the same 1780 period, yeah.
So I'll give one final question and then I'll open it up to you all. When it comes to building or research, what do you think is coming next for you in particular? What's your focus or your priority when it comes to banjo building? Let's start with Dr. Dena.
I'd like to extend what I consider when I look at gourd instruments, not just the banjo, into the greater African diaspora. Because I have, I spent my life hearing, yep, you're from Africa, yep, you're African, African extraction, African descent, African diaspora, blah, blah, blah. I wore all the kente cloth, I learned how to do African dance, I was doing all this stuff. And then when I got to do the DNA testing, it turns out we're Ethiopian. So it's like, I want to look closer at those things. So I've been building krars, I've been building banjiras from Bangladesh, which is another part of my heritage. So it's like, I want to look at other, because as cool and as wonderful as the banjo is in North America, imagine what those instruments are doing in Bangladesh, or what they're doing in Ethiopia, or what they're doing in South America, or all these other places where we have been, where our footprint has been in the sand. Imagine the instruments there, and that gets me really excited.
I just want to build more and really like hone my skills. I have kids and I want to build a banjo for my daughter. She's always asking, and I'm like kind of halfway there, so I want to finish that for her, and eventually get to the point where I can share that knowledge with other people.
As far as my work goes, I'm going to be taking a little break for a couple of years. I've been at this 35 years. I'm going to join Kristina where she's getting her PhD in England. When I come back to it, I would like to find a way to make it less and less a way to sort of be dealing with the financial demands of life and be more creative, work more on passion projects. Some will be historical, some will just be aesthetic. And then I'm always animated by the history and just learning more, collecting more data, because putting this history out in the world can be pretty slippery. Like when I first went to Galax in 1994 with the gourd banjo, nobody knew what it was, and they came talk to me, and I had the floor. They're like, "What is that?" And then I'd be able to lay out the whole history, and like, okay, I guess this is an African American thing. I didn't know that, and they didn't have much to say. But now everybody can come say to you in an unnuanced way, the banjo is African, right? And I'm like, I know what you're getting at, but there's still like contingents that don't want to let go of white authorship of the instrument. They'll say, sure, yeah, it became a black thing, but my white ancestors were part of that since the 1600s too. And you'll see people singing Appalachian ballads with a gourd banjo now, and these distortions do not want to go away. So that's like, how much time do we? To answer an earlier question, I never leave this at the bench, right? I'm just always chewing on this stuff and thinking about it as I see it entering the world more directly. So that'll always be part of my future as well.
From the history and research side, I'm just really glad to see so many younger Black scholars taking up this work. There's a lot of things that are very ugly and a lot of things that are really hard to deal with when you're looking at this. But Amina, who's here, did her master's at UMBC and was researching just Black banjo in Maryland, right? Like, there are all of these things that can be done and can be researched and can be kind of the springboard. And that's truly, I say this at the end of Well of Souls, which is let this be a beginning point for people when you read something interesting in it, when you see something maybe that you feel like I got wrong, to go and say, okay, what more can I learn? What can I explore? And add to this dialogue and be, just this really this Well of Souls is not the end point. It's the starting point in my mind for this research to expand and broaden.
Give our panelists a round of applause. So we have time for questions. Yes.
So I'm interested. Pete Ross said there's
we have a
something spiritual in the way that the banjo was. There was something limiting about how the frame. I don't know all the terms.
Okay,
but I want more details. Like, tell us more about why that particular architecture didn't work, please.
Well, it all works. It all serves a purpose, right? So basically, instruments, if you don't play an instrument, and you want the strings to run as close to the fingerboard as you can. That's an ideal because it makes it easy to play. You don't have to press very far. This is true of modern banjos. It's true of basically any banjos after around 1840 that we see. And it's true of instruments from prior to the Americas, Europe, South Asia, and Africa as well. So what we found in the earliest banjos is that, so let's look at this. This is a band. This is one I broke. And so if you want the strings to be close to the neck, sorry, I need two hands to gesticulate. You also want the neck at the same level as what's called the soundboard. This is the surface that vibrates. This is where the bridge sits on it. Strings go from that over the fingerboard. So what you would want would be the neck right on the plane this is where the skin would have been. But what we find in every one of the surviving banjos is that the neck is instead dropped down to the middle of this opening in the gourd. What that was, and you see this in the old plantation painting, the John Sloan image from the late 17th century, they'd cut this end of the gourd off, put the neck through there, cut the side off where the drum head would be, and then the other end of the neck comes out the other side. And what they consistently are, it comes out the bottom side. This is where like the blossom would have been on the gourd when it grew. And what it is the gourd, the neck enters the gourd through the center of this opening and comes out the center of the bottom, this hole here. And it's consistently that way, and I was like, well, is it to make it stronger? Why would they choose to do that? It makes it harder to play. And this brings us to the spiritual element that Kristina revealed when she was studying where...
And Laurent Dubois talked a little bit about the cosmogram. So this is a gourd that's intended to be a replica of the Haitian bancha. And you can see these crosses on here, and Laurent Dubois posited that those were not, Christian crosses, but rather cosmograms, very common in Central Africa, the intersection of the spiritual and the earthly plane.
The spiritual plane, vertically, the horizontal plane is here on Earth. And he said this to me because I made a banjo for my friend Chikamal Jabate to play in the Slavery and the Making of America PBS film. I was like, man, did I just make for my Muslim buddy like this thing with crosses all over it? And he's like, no. That's not what these crosses are. And then.
And so I was
Fleshed that
talking
out.
about that and thinking about that, and then, Pete and I were discussing, and he's like, well, that is essentially how this instrument is constructed, is that it is, the body of the gourd is the vessel, and the neck is this divining rod, really, of a way to get spirits into.
Draws the spirits down, contains them in the gourd.
Yeah.
And what Kristina said to me is like, it's not just the crosses on the gourd. It's throughout it's the Om 4 and Vodou practice at the central pole, the spiritual plane, the center, and this pattern is repeated again and again, and then plus the vessels arranged around, not just Vodou, but Santeria.
And in John Rose's watercolor,
John Rose's
people just
watercolor
assume,
right
that must
there.
be alcohol that's at the base of the feet of the musicians.
No, this had a spiritual
But
function
it
too.
could
And then
have a
as soon as she
spiritual,
laid it
yeah.
out to me, it has to go through the center again and again. I was like, well, that's the early gourd banjos, and that answered my question that I could not see it through the lens of somebody who practiced this religion. Simple as that. I didn't have that.
And we see this then consistently from, the late 17th century, late 1600s through, when this banjo was collected in 1840 and when another banjo was collected in Suriname around 1850.
Let's just state it plainly. The early banjo, until it adopts the wooden rim, the early banjo, the gourd banjo, is a spiritual device to draw the spirits of your ancestors and then contain them in the gourd.
Thank you.
Good morning. This is an honor to be and a privilege to be among you. In my research over the years, because my father was a very prolific composer, arranger, artist in repertoire, executive, and his name is Henry Bernard Glover. You may have heard of him. We could never really put him in one area, and that's what was really interesting when I started doing all of the historical and genealogy. He was probably one of the first artists, producers to do cross fusions. So he would have a song, he would write, produce, and then they would perform for a country artist, and then they would remix it, and then they would have it in R&B. And the crossover presented a lot of things like rockabilly and folk art. And I was wondering how that has meshed with your banjos. And then you state that it's a renaissance. And just how you see this type of preservation of a musical interest will go into the other genres like country and R&B. And now Latin America, there's a lot of great, and you can hear the sounds of the variety of instruments that have made their way from Africa through the diaspora and then into the Caribbean and South America, making their way up. And then here we go with Appalachia, and all these other pieces. So my question again is, how do you see there being like this formula that brings all of these genres together and highlights the banjo? Well,
Maybe that's a question for Lily.
So I'm in a unique seat because I get to actually see the banjo in all of those arenas and in all of these different hands. I also interact quite a bit with those who might not be willing to update their understanding of the history and the storyline that we all understand now. I think it's easy in some of those spaces to ignore the history because it was not prevalent when those genres became popular. It's also difficult to start a movement where you're reclaiming history, certainly incomplete history.
Yeah, one of the, and thank your dad for one of the ways that
I'm a music nerd, what can I say?
you're in good company. One of the ways that we can look at that through line is rhythm.
Yes.
So, like, I was told, I was playing songs while I was working my way through medical school at coffee houses. And some of you know Andy Cohen. Andy Cohen is an ethnomusicologist, really good friend of mine. He says, you realize you're playing banjo tunes on the guitar. And I said, what's a banjo tune? I had no idea what he was talking about. He said, pre-internet, go to Library of Congress and look up these people. And I did. I came here and I sat in a booth down there, gave it to the librarian, they pulled, and it was all the music I heard as a kid growing up. That same rhythm that passes through that is the same rhythm in the bum diddy, okay? It's the same boom chicka of rock and roll. Is the same, you know, I can spend time with Afro-Mexican, this specific, Afro-Mexican musicians playing son jarocho and flatfoot to their stuff. So that's what ties it all through, and we're doing all of that on the banjo.
Oh, good. I'd like to learn more about that, too.
Well, and I guess I'll even...
Can I recommend a book real quick? Melvin Gibbs's How Black Music Took Over the World. It's a new book, and because he's a bass player, he talks a lot about. He's a bass player, but he also plays rhythm. Bass is rhythm, maybe. But it's a really great book where he explores kind of his experience growing up in New York City, learning from Afro-Latin musicians in New York, and then also playing with some Brazilian musicians and playing with country musicians, and how he's crossing these genres.
What's his name again?
Melvin Gibbs.
Gibbs.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. I'll look him up.
I spend a lot of time in bluegrass spaces. Yeah. And there's a bluegrass festival in France, and there are bluegrass bands from all over the world that perform. And after 10 years of working alongside banjo enthusiasts like yourselves, this festival surprised me because it was a whole new version of banjo love that I hadn't seen, because I am here. I live here, you know, like I hadn't interacted with our music elsewhere. So the crossroads is everywhere. You can get into what you're interested in. And I think people who are interested in the history have no problem carrying it with them. And people who are not interested in the history are not going to talk about it.
So, yeah. So you stay with the folks who really love the music and creation, and that's where we, little by little, chip away.
Yeah.
And we'll make a difference.
And you keep playing at the people that don't want to hear it. You know, because what better instrument to do that with than a banjo, right?
We do keep showing up.
Look, can I say something really quickly?
Absolutely.
In response to that question as well, I feel like a lot of people in this room might already know this, but just in case, like, to make it a huge oversimplification, sort of the recurring event in American popular music culture of white people in the music industry taking a vernacular black form, commercializing it and reselling it, making it a product and reselling it to the public. Like, we keep coming back to this, happens again and again. You can name it from jazz through hip hop, right? And a lot of stops along the way. But the origin point where this first really occurs is in minstrelsy in the early 19th century, and the center focus of which was fascination with the banjo. So here it is at this sort of moment, this sort of crossing of the vernacular with the commercial, and that fascination and the appropriation is all out there.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
In acknowledging that building a banjo itself is ceremony, I'm just curious if y'all have any explicit or implicit ceremonies that you all do consciously or unconsciously when you are doing that thing. Does that make sense?
I love that question.
I mean, it's simple for me. When I finally strung up an early style banjo, the first thing I try to play with it is a piece I know is likely from the earliest repertoire that might have been played on an instrument like that. That's it. Well, it's many tunes. Is there one in mind?
No, I was just trying to do a quick plug for Rhiannon and I's book.
Oh well, often it's the book they've retitled "Throw the Banjo Out of Tune." That's in Go Back and Fetch It. It's one of several. Yeah.
I start with that gourd plant that's there and the little blossom that comes up, singing to it, watching it grow into the size that I can work with, twinning it along a vine or watching it go across the ground. Looking at that piece of wood in the lumber yard before my husband mills it, looking at that grain, singing to it, talking to it, listening to it as it drops on the bench and hearing it ring out. So I don't know that there's a moment that I'm not communing with that on some spiritual level. Yeah. And goodness knows if I did gut strings, I'd be petting a cat, you know. But I mean, it's you ask me, but I mean, there's all kinds of ways.
Samaria?
I'll say for the second banjo that I made, because I had the opportunity to design it for myself this time, I definitely had a process of, I think, thinking about the work that you all have done to uncover the spiritual nature of the banjo, thinking about how do I add elements of spirituality and kind of hide it in plain sight in this instrument. So that's something that I want to continue to explore, and so there was a process of figuring out how to design this banjo.
Yeah, which is so cool because that is what the makers, the maker of the Haitian bancha sometime in the late 18th century was doing too, hiding that stuff in plain sight. They understood it, but maybe, the enslavers didn't.
This is a question for any of the panelists. In 2026, what are your thoughts on how accurate or misleading the title of Laurent Dubois' book, referring to the banjo as America's African instrument, considering that there weren't banjos in Africa? I've done presentations on the history of the banjo, and I've kind of borrowed that phrase, but I'm wondering if I should retire it or if that's a legitimate way to consider the banjo.
I think the title of his book was always intended as, I don't know if a metaphor is quite the right word, but as, an idea rather than a literal statement, which is, because he talks very clearly about its Caribbean origins and this idea of a creolized instrument. And so I think it's, there's I'm sure there's some linguist here at the Library of Congress that can help us with this, but the semantic difference between African instrument and an instrument from Africa, right? That those are different semantically, those mean different things. And so if we think of it as America's African instrument, as African American, as being this product of the Americas, but deeply, deeply rooted in African instruments, spirituality, traditions, music making, kind of complicates that. And I think the big thing for me all the time is the nuance, right? That your 10-second clip on Instagram isn't going to do for explaining and fully embracing this history.
I think we always have to remember that anything we say when we're looking at historical perspective and culture, that it's to start dialogue. If we think anything we say is going to be etched in stone, we're working on an archive now. We were laughing the other day, 100 years from now, people are going to say, they taped numbers to books? And they used cello? What was wrong with them? Anything we're doing now, we don't know what it's going to look like 100 years from now, but it should at least start a dialogue. And just like in Joe's opening, he said, how many of you know this is an African instrument? And my hand kind of went like, you know, because I didn't want to raise my hand, but I didn't want to put it down either. But then he pulled that out, what that means. So I say use the language that you use, start the dialogues that you start, and run with it.
I'd like to add something to that. Number one, with the book, the title of the book makes sense and would fit our understanding of it if you read the whole book. But, you know, like Kristina said, you don't get, if you're giving a talk, you don't have time for all that explanation, you know. But there's another concept in studying this history and the history of all sorts of vernacular musics that I really chafe at, and I think the assumption that certain groups of people are only vessels for tradition and do not contribute their own artistry along the way over hundreds of years of history is again, it's a sort of a quiet form of prejudice. And I think that's one of the real reasons we need to let go of saying the banjo is African, because that hundreds of years here, post Middle Passage, that the instrument lived, people are capable of adding things to tradition. They're not simply vessels for tradition. No person is.
I just had a question with, we've talked about the rhythm in particular, and a lot of the conversation is around the music of the banjo. Just wondering how much research has gone into the history of the dance movements that have accompanied that. Dr. Deja, I believe you mentioned several different dances that you knew. But say going back to the history, we'll say plantation era, I've worked with groups like the Gullah Geechee, enslaved folks that were enslaved along the coast, southeast coast. Much of their music is it's rhythmically based, but not accompanied by anything other than that. But then wondering, with your work, your research, are you getting information or insight on what early dances may have existed when the banjo became maybe more prevalently utilized in those, say, enslaved communities?
Dance research is very hard to do. Again, we have a lot of racism in the lens of people viewing it, right? So they just say, oh, that looked like African dance, or that looked like European dance, without a lot of nuance of what that meant. And the idea of like recording what were the dance steps that people were actually doing, what, if you could describe those body movements in a way that was seemingly neutral, like what would they then be? So we have a lot of descriptions of dances. There are many dances where people are described as in a circle, not as kind of organized, I would say, as the ring shout, but in similar styles. And then, again, sometimes it's just like as basic as like, oh, it was a partner dance, or there was two people dancing, and then, when one of them got tired, the other one jumped in. So we try to piece that together. There's a lot of dance descriptions in Well of Souls, but it's still a place where I think, and April Maston has written about some interesting connections between mid-Atlantic dance and kind of exporting it as, the internal slave trade in the United States really ramped up, of people being kind of born in the Chesapeake region and then being shipped south, and how that moved dance. But yeah, so it's hard, but it's just like I am always I'm always the optimist. I'm here. I'll tell this funny story. There's a book that I really want to see that's here at the Library of Congress. I go into the rare books room. I have asked for it. They're like, it's not on the shelf. We don't know where it is. The librarian told me, every time you come here, just put in a request. See if it turns up. And that's kind of how I feel about historical research, that if you just keep looking, if you just keep digging, you will get something and you will get more stuff, and that will add to this corpus of research that we can then start saying, like, instead of it just being, oh, this is a dance that was called Kalinda, and yet it has 100 different descriptions, can we make those more nuanced and say, you know, this is how it looked here, this is how it looked there. So more research.
Other than the unnamed and barely repeatable jig that I do in my shop while I'm making things, the absolute best resource locally for that information is Junius Brickhouse. We spent time with him yesterday as part of our cohort before this event. He is, Junius is, how many here know Junius? He is amazing. So you want to take a look at the work that he's doing. He is a tradition bearer of house, dance, and hip hop. He has his toe in the water here at Library of Congress. He's pretty amazing, and he can speak ad nauseum, not ad nauseum, at length on different types of dances. And he gives his apologies. He wished he could have been here today to be with us, but he's out there doing it. You know.
Thank you. I'd like to sort of footnote quickly Kristina's answer, which is one of the likely origin points for the name banjo is a dance ritual from Suriname called the bancha. And you can still go to Suriname and see people performing this dance, and it's the dance you see around the banjo and the John Rose watercolor and other images and other descriptions of the banjo going back to the, I guess, early 18th through the early 19th century. And Kristina and I went down there and saw it, and it was wild to see women dancers jump out with the cloths between their hands, doing the dance that in that watercolor I'd studied for decades.
Dr. Wellman.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here up from North Carolina. And was with C.C. Conway just last Friday, celebrating the Folklife Festival in Durham, North Carolina. I wanted to ask the panel, and maybe Dr. Dena may, because she referenced this briefly, relative to talking about sound, physics. But as makers, and this being an instrument, I was wondering if you could, each of you or some of you, comment on it as technology. So maybe we're taking it from the aesthetic sense and the music, but if you could comment on it as technology, and yes, technology develops over time and finds new uses. Look at the turntable and hip hop. So, if you could, please.
Do it. I love physics. Absolutely love physics. Thought about doing that before I did medicine in my undergrad. But I'm always looking at string length. Pete talked about action. I'm looking at string diameter. I'm looking at the vibration of the string and how it resolves over time. Looking at all these things when I'm building an instrument, because more often than not, I'll have a professor from a university come to me and say, a guy came to me the other day and asked, can you build a PIN-PF for me? And I was like, yeah, tell me what you want. What do you want to tune the strings to? What's your string length? What's a comfortable string length for you? And then from that, I had to backtrack to find a string that would do what we needed it to do, and then find a company that actually makes those strings that you can buy individually, so I didn't have to go through 6-7 packs to get one string. And I love that stuff. I can do that stuff all day long. You know, even down to looking at the size of the slot that you put in the bridge or the nut to see if you want to get a little more nuance of like a sitar, a little bit of vibration without a buzz. That's a tightrope. Texture, a little bit of vibration without the buzz, but just enough to keep that string so it doesn't want to hop out of the, so we can go on. Yeah.
And then we have time for one more.
I think you wanted to know something.
I have a second.
Yep.
thinking about the technology, one of the questions in my head when I was trying to recreate gourd banjos, like one of the toughest commodities for a person making a banjo early on was plenty of wood around, probably gourds around, probably nails, or you could cut them out of wood. But your most scarce commodity would have been time as an enslaved person. And one of the revelations of a banjo or other instruments made with a similar technology is the skin soundboard. You tack it over an opening, put a bridge on it, it'll vibrate, it'll make tone. You do it pretty quickly. There's no thicknessing of wood and gluing. It's tacks, let it dry overnight, and you've got something that's good to go. But that's also why the banjo was quick to be mass produced after the craze of minstrelsy. You didn't have to have trained luthiers in a urban factory setting or small factory setting. You just tack that head on. There, people want these instruments, and you can crank them out.
Hello, thank you for taking my question or statement. I'm Dr. Angela Wellman, founding director of the Oakland Public Conservatory of Music in Oakland, which centers the African American experience and role in the development of American music in the Americas. There have been a number of things that I've heard today. I'm trying to pick something to respond to and ask you also to respond to, and that something came up for me, and it's an elephant in the room. As we talk about this instrument, we have to talk about the people. And then there's this idea of the embrace of the people. And many of the people who play this instrument and attempt to enter into spaces are not embraced. However, we're embracing the research. Thank you so much for the research and kind of trying to set the record straight. I wanted to also, something that I often think about is this idea of the banjo coming from Africa. I loved the conversation, the clarification of the semantics. Thank you for that. And I think that every time someone says, yeah, the banjo came from Africa, we totally negate the lives of the people who actually went through what they went through to come to the creation of that instrument. So, in your work, in your conversations, I'm wondering how, if this comes up and how it does, and how you speak to the embrace of the people as we embrace the instrument. And when we look in this room, the majority of the people in here are not descended from those, or I say ascended from the creators of that instrument. So, let's just talk about that just a little bit, if we could.
I'm going to talk about that as I close this session, if that's all right. It's a time constraint. So when you're talking about the people in particular, who often are not in the room or turned away from the room or uncomfortable in the room, that's kind of where my work comes in, not as a builder, not as a researcher, but as a community organizer and like a advocate for those who don't have that platform or the invite. And so it does come up more often than you'd think. And they're really uncomfortable conversations at 4 a.m. But I think there are those of us willing to do that labor so that many of the people in this room don't have to. In my role as a retailer, it is my job to support all musicians, whether they understand history or not. And so being able to be on this stage and have this conversation with those who are interested is a lovely experience. But will I be having this conversation at other conferences and festivals and symposiums over the next decade? Absolutely. And the history that has been added to, Dena said, we are here to stay in dialogue. And Kristina said, if you disagree with something you read, tell me. These traditions, this tradition is constantly growing and changing and being added to. And like in this room, we are tradition bearers because we're having the conversation and we're not leaving the room and we're not letting our feelings get so riled up that we can't have the conversation. And I think that's kind of the hardest part, is when you are challenging someone's understanding of history, especially a history that they feel attached to, they're reacting to an attack that doesn't exist. And so in recreating and building these instruments, in researching these instruments and the people that built them, continue to build them, the dialogue continues, the history continues, and the erasure can stop happening. And with that,